Director Brennan, he makes a really good point, right? So can you explain to folks who these rebels are who are now in charge, the folks who toppled Assad, and whether you think they can potentially govern Syria going forward without all of the complications and, frankly, the backtracking that happened before?
Well, Chris, I think Matt teed up very well. The Syrian opposition over the last 14 years has been a very diverse constellation of various militias, terrorist groups, other types of gangs and rivals that really over the last 14 years have been fighting among themselves, which really undermine their ability to topple Assad. Jawlani has been very effective in terms of trying to bring together as many of these groups as possible under this broad coalition. And as was pointed out, he has moderated a lot of his rhetoric over the past number of years. And so this very quick collapse of the Syrian military is being met with jubilation across Syria, and quite obviously because Bashar Assad was a real ruthless authoritarian leader who killed and tortured so many Syrians. But I must say, when I look at the history of in the Arab world of leaders, authoritarian leaders who have been toppled, the aftermath has really not been all that good when you think about Iraq or Yemen or Libya and Sudan. And so I think there's a lot of anxiety because although this coalition was united because they had a common enemy, that enemy now is gone. And so the question is whether or not they can govern or they can participate in a governance structure that really is going to address the myriad of problems that the Syrian people face, because much of that country has been destroyed, the infrastructure is destroyed, the economy is awful, it's in shambles, and a lot of parts of Syria are still ungoverned. And as we saw with CENTCOM strikes against ISIS, there is concern that the power vacuum that is created now by the fall of the Assad regime is going to be filled by some of these groups that are going to continue to pursue rather radical and extremist agendas.
Yeah, Michael, the question becomes, is it ungoverned or ungovernable? I think David Sanger, in your paper, said the question moving forward is whether the fall of Assad represents liberation, which obviously is the hope of all the people who are celebrating on the streets, or simply a prelude to more military action. So what will you be watching for?
Well, Chris, I think the biggest thing we're going to be watching for is the potential reconstitution of terrorist groups or activities by groups that are now claiming to be more moderate, but maybe still have a terrorist nature that would threaten the U.S. and its allies. I think that's the top priority right now for the United States, is essentially keeping a lid on any sort of activity that could threaten U.S. troops in the region, U.S. nationals in the area, or the American homeland. And so you've already seen the Biden administration hitting ISIS really hard out in the desert, partly to ensure that the ISIS fighters who still are operating in Syria can't take advantage of this moment, move into the cities, maybe seize strategic positions that have oil, weapons, God forbid, chemical weapons. So that's the top priority. But then you have a bunch of other potential concerns. If you have, new spasms of violence that could push more refugees out of Syria. Of course, we know that the Syrian civil war created a refugee crisis throughout a lot of Europe. Could you have more waves of refugees if there's sort of new degrees of fighting in the country? Israel, what does this mean for Israel? Are there going to be new threats to Israel? On the one hand, it's good news for Israel that Iran has lost its key ally in Bashar Assad, but how does it work now? Are there new threats from some of the new groups that have control in the country, and again potentially have access to chemical weapons? And you're already seeing the Israelis conduct strikes. So you have those first order security questions, you have the migration questions, you have instability generally, which can ripple through this region. So there's a lot to worry about. And just in conclusion, the officials that I've been talking to and hearing from, they have a lot more questions than answers right now. They're really in wait and see mode. I'm going to see how this unfolds, but they're very anxious.
And one of the questions, obviously, that's key, Director Brennan, is what the U.S. role in all of this is. Donald Trump posted a message on social media basically saying the U.S. should stay out of it. Is that an option, a viable option?
Well, we're also in this critical transition period between the Biden administration and the Trump administration.
Right.
And so I think the United States, irrespective of the administration in power, is going to have to continue to watch very carefully, because the reverberations of this collapse of the Assad regime can affect neighboring states. As Matt has pointed out, Israel, Jordan, Iraq. And so this Sunni Islamist coalition has been pulled together. And they have relations with ISIS. They have roots in Al-Qaeda. So there's just a lot of concern. And so I don't think the United States wants to get in there and do anything in terms of trying to shape the future at this point. But we also have 900 troops or so in the north as well as in the south of Syria, trying to ensure that we're able to monitor and to address any further growth of ISIS elements inside of Syria. So the Trump administration, when it comes in, it's going to have to deal with this. I do think that there's probably going to be a standoff position that Donald Trump is advocating for, but we cannot just sit back and just watch things collapse if, in fact, this is going to have, again, further ramifications across the region.
Michael, another of your colleagues at the Times, Tom Friedman, as he often does, summarized some thoughts very, very well. He wrote this: "Attention, Mr. Trump. Syria is the keystone of the entire Middle East. It just collapsed like a blown-up bridge, creating vast new dangers and opportunities that everyone in the region will seize upon and react to. Staying out of this is not on the menu, especially when we have several hundred U.S. troops stationed in eastern Syria. We need to figure out our interests and use the events in Syria to drive them, because everyone else will be doing just that." And the question always, right, and again, Donald Trump is not new to this in the sense of he was president for 4 years before. But is it an opportunity for someone with more experience and knowledge of the region, Marco Rubio, who is likely to get confirmed for Secretary of State, to help him do that? Again, what do you think the internal machinations in the White House might be, or that folks who are very vested in this and knowledgeable about it will be looking at?
Well, Chris, I think you're going to see, as is the case on a bunch of foreign policy issues, a pretty hot debate within Trump's advisory circle. And I think it's really hard to know how it's going to play out. As you mentioned, that there are people around Trump right now, including Marco Rubio, who have been very hawkish on Syria and very committed to the idea that the U.S. should be taking more action to try to shape events there. On the other hand, Trump's selection to be director of national intelligence, Tulsi Gabbard, was somebody who met with Bashar Assad, who portrayed the rebels as terrorists. And in some cases they are, it's factually true, but with a broad brush essentially said that the rebels are bad guys and Assad should remain in power. And there are a lot of people around Trump who are very non-interventionist, who believe the U.S. overextended itself. And then look at Trump's record itself in his first term. One of his, I believe his first use of military action was when he struck some Syrian chemical weapons sites to punish the use of chemical weapons. But then Trump went on and cut off U.S. support for the Syrian rebels. So, it's the evidence, the data points are kind of all over the map, and it's really just guesswork at this point. And I think there's going to be a feverish argument internally. And who knows, it may just be policy by improvisation. We'll have to wait and see.